Hi, everybody. We're ready for chapter 14 and where they begin their work in China. The new missionaries of the China Inland Mission did not have to wait long for God to answer their prayers for accommodation. The first missionaries to come aboard the Lemmermuir to welcome them to China was William Gamble of the American Presbyterian Mission. William Gamble had been living in Ningpo at the same time as Hudson, and they had become friends. Now he was excited to be welcoming his old friend back to China. William Gamble was the printer for the American Presbyterian Mission, and he had recently moved from Ningpo to Shanghai to set up a new printing press. He had bought a large warehouse close to the old city to house the new press, but the printing equipment had been delayed, so his warehouse stood empty. When he found out the new missionaries had nowhere to stay, he insisted they use his warehouse for as long as they liked while they arranged the permits they needed to move inland. The warehouse would be more than big enough for all of them and their equipment and supplies. The next day the group joyfully unloaded their belongings from the Lemmermuir and moved into the warehouse. After drying out their wet belongings and washing all of their clothes and bedding, it was time for them to get down to business. Hudson hired a barber, who shaved the front of each man's head and wove a false queue into the hair that was left. Next, the group were all outfitted with Chinese clothes. As they emerged from the warehouse onto the street, a collection of both foreigners and Chinese stopped to look and laugh. The men in particular had a difficult time keeping their pants pulled up and not tripping over the curled up ends of their new shoes. There was even an article in the Shanghai newspaper about the new China Inland Mission. In the article, the writer called them the Pigtail Mission. Too many foreigners in Shanghai, the behavior of the new mission was both un-British and un-Christian. Missionaries from other organizations often crossed the street when they saw someone from the China Inland Mission approaching. They wanted nothing to do with such a weird group of people. All of this caused some of the new missionaries to wonder whether wearing Chinese clothing and having a Chinese hairstyle was the right approach. But Hudson reminded them that they would be leaving soon for the interior, where they would meet multiplied thousands of people who had never seen a white person before. Do you want to be remembered for the strange Western clothes you wore, or for the message of salvation you preached? He asked them. The new missionaries could see his point and spent more time practicing how to roll up the sleeves of their tunics and eat rice with chopsticks. 3 weeks after arriving, the paperwork was complete, and the China Inland Mission had permission to leave Shanghai for Hangzhou. Before they left, several missionaries from other groups came to talk to Hudson. They told him he was crazy. How could he encourage 9 unmarried women to venture into the interior? Didn't he know that in all of China there was not one unmarried woman working away from the 5 treaty ports? Hudson did know, and as they spoke, he thought back to Brighton Beach and all God had shown him there. He would do all he could to keep the women safe, but God had called them, and each woman knew the risk involved. William Gamble had grown attached to the missionaries staying in his warehouse. He was sad to see them go, and he did not want to take the rent money they insisted on paying him. He came to the dock to see them off. It was a beautiful moonlit night when they boarded the junks that would take them 100 miles up the Huangpu River to Hangzhou. William Gamble helped them aboard, and before waving goodbye, he left a small package on the seat of the last junk. When the package was opened, it contained all the rent money they had paid him for the use of the warehouse and a note that read, "For the good of the mission." The junks floated silently out onto the river past the docks, where the Lemmermuir was still tied up undergoing repairs. The crew had been looking out for the missionaries, and when they saw them, they begged Hudson to come aboard for one last service. By the light of the moon, the missionaries clambered up the rope ladder over the side of the ship onto the familiar deck of the Lemmermuir. Hudson preached a short sermon on the foredeck, and they sang some hymns together. Mr. Brunton asked if they could travel upstream with the party for a few days, and Captain Bell gave his permission. So with one more member than when they had started, the group reboarded their junks. As they floated out on the river, the crew and the missionaries sang together, "Yes, we part, but not forever," the same hymn that had annoyed so many of the crew when they first heard it on the East India Company dock in London. Now they themselves were singing it as loud as they could, not caring what the sailors on nearby ships thought. Mr. Brunton traveled with them for 3 days, and Hudson baptized him in the river before he returned to the Lemmermuir in Shanghai. The trip to Hangzhou was very slow, and it was 4 weeks before the junks finally docked there. The city of 1,000,000 people was as beautiful as Hudson had told everyone it would be. Although heavily damaged during the Taiping Rebellion, it had been mostly rebuilt, and there were lots of lakes and open fields in and around the city. Just as in Shanghai, there were few houses to rent in Hangzhou, but after several days, Hudson managed to find the perfect place, that is, if you used a lot of imagination. The house at number 1 New Lane was one of those buildings that had not been repaired after the Taiping Rebellion. It had enormous holes in its walls, and what was left of the walls were caked with mud. But the house was also huge. It was a 2-story building and had over 30 rooms. Hudson could immediately see the possibilities. There would be a hospital and dispensary downstairs and living space upstairs. The house also had a courtyard with a beautiful rock garden and pond where the children could play safely. The team set about quietly repairing the house. They knew most of the people in the city had never seen a foreigner before, and they didn't want to scare them, so they left the windows open and curtains undrawn most of the time, so their neighbors could see what they were doing. Soon they had little groups of Chinese people watching them eat rice and vegetables with chopsticks and swat the flies away with large grass fans. Slowly, the people peering in through the windows got braver. They hung around the doorway and finally ventured inside. One or two curious people opened a sea chest to see what was kept inside. They turned the handle on the clothes wringer and pretended to feed clothes through it like the foreign women did. A few of the braver ones examined the women's long hair, which came in strange colors, white like a silkworm's thread or brown like a hemp rope. They looked into the foreigners' blue and gray eyes, and they laughed at their long bumpy noses. They rubbed freckles to see if they were painted on, and came to the conclusion that although the foreigners had some unfortunate deformities, they were not all that different from themselves. News of the friendly foreigners spread through the city. Before long, the house on New Lane was a hive of activity. The hospital opened, and soon over 200 patients a day were coming to receive medical care. Sui, one of the converts from the Bridge Street Church in Ningpo, joined the team. He spent his days preaching and talking to the crowds that came to the house. After particularly difficult operations to move cataracts, for example, Hudson would take a break by singing hymns and playing the harmonium. The patients loved it. Hudson would sing at the top of his voice and then climb on the top of a desk and preach his heart out. Life was never dull at the house on New Lane. Maria often sat with the patients, praying with those who seemed frightened and telling Bible stories to the children. She also had another baby of her own to look after. Little Maria was the baby sister Grace had wanted for so long. In late summer, the Taylor family took a much-needed break. Maria and the 5 children, Grace, Herbert, Howard, Samuel, and little Maria, stayed in the mountains outside the city where Hudson divided his time between there and the work in Hangzhou. The children found new energy to climb and explore away from the heat of the city. They ran and swam all day long, wearing themselves out by nightfall. But one morning, about a week into their stay in the mountains, Grace did not want to get out of bed. Maria brought her food, but Grace was not hungry. As the day wore on, Maria became very concerned, so she sent for Hudson. By the time he arrived, Grace's temperature was soaring. He examined her carefully, then he quietly slipped out of the room and motioned for Maria to follow him. He walked silently down to the pond where the children liked to swim. There he spoke to Maria in a halting voice. "There is no hope of Grace getting better. She has meningitis, and there is no cure." Someone stayed with Grace every minute, wiping her brow, singing to her, and praying for her. 5 days later, while Hudson and Maria and many of those who had been with them on the Lemmermuir gathered around her bed and sang hymns, Grace died peacefully. Hudson missed her terribly. He cried for days. Everything he did and saw reminded him of Grace. He walked past the lake and saw the swans they liked to feed together. He looked out his surgery window and saw the little swing in the courtyard that she had asked him to make for her. It now hung still. But the work in Hangzhou went on, and while there was sorrow, there was also joy. William Rudlin and Mary Bell were married. Wang Lejeune, who had accompanied Hudson and Maria to England 7 years before, joined them. Pastor Wang, as he was now called, started a small church. Soon it had 50 baptized believers. The church was active in reaching out to the rest of the community with the gospel message. 4 other mission stations were also opened in nearby cities, and the China Inland Mission was beginning to grow as new missionaries arrived from England. There were still so many other challenges in China, though, and Hudson was getting restless. He had been in Hangzhou for nearly 2 years, and it was time for him to move further inland. Jenny Faulding and the McCarthys, who had joined the team in Hangzhou from England, agreed to stay and support Wang Lejeune, while the rest of the group packed their belongings once again. In June 1868, they boarded a houseboat headed for Yangzhou, 200 miles farther inland. They sailed up the Grand Canal, crossed the Yangtze River, and then sailed another 12 miles up the canal until they arrived in Yangzhou. the city Marco Polo had been governor of in the 13th century. Like Tung Chau, which Hudson had visited 13 years before with John Burton, Yang Chau was known for the unruly behavior of its inhabitants. Aware of this, the members of the China Inland Mission stayed quietly on their houseboat until late July, when they moved into a large house Hudson had rented. The house was close to several other houses and had a number of outbuildings for team members to live in. Hudson hired some carpenters who spent several weeks working to repair and improve the house so that the team would be able to make better use of it for their ministry. Few foreigners had ventured into Yangchao, and so the team was very cautious as they made contact with the local inhabitants. A number of the educated people in the city were not happy to see the foreign missionaries. They believed that the foreigners would undermine their Confucianist beliefs, so they began spreading rumors about the group, saying they ate babies and gouged out the eyes of dying people. The locals believed what they heard and what they read on the posters that appeared around the city, listing all the disgusting practices the foreigners engaged in. People began to gather outside the Inland Mission House and chant and jeer at those outside. At first there had been 100 protesters, but each night there were more. Finally, on Saturday night, August 22nd, 1868, there were nearly 10,000 protesters gathered outside the house. The chanting of the mob filled the house. The foreign devils have eaten 24 children. The foreign devils have eaten 24 children, the mob screamed. Rocks and mud balls exploded against the courtyard walls, and angry people pushed at the gate, which was chained shut. There must be at least 8,000 of them, Hudson said to Maria, and every one of them thinks we want to eat their children. No wonder they're angry. Maria nodded. Herbert, Howard, Samuel, and little Maria were huddled around their mother, who was holding the newest baby, Charles. The missionaries quickly began barricading themselves in the house. They nailed the shutters closed and piled tables and other furniture in front of the door. Hudson then gathered them all together. In addition to Maria and himself and their 5 children, there were 3 men and 5 women from the China Inland Mission, as well as 19 Chinese Christians in the house. The crowd is very angry. I don't think they'll stop until they have revenge, said Hudson. William Rutland and Henry Reed nodded. Some of the earlier crowds had been ugly, but nothing like this. Our best hope, Hudson went on, is to get the Mandarin quickly and ask him for help. He is the only one who can stop this. I'll go, volunteered George Duncan. Me too, added William Rutland. No, said Hudson, the Mandarin knows me. He knows I am the leader of the mission. I must go. George will come with me. William, you stay here and help Henry to protect the others. Hudson kissed Maria and the children goodbye, and with George Duncan slipped out into the courtyard and disappeared through a neighbor's house. They walked quickly. Once they reached the street, they backed on to their house. If they kept their heads down and did not run, maybe they would not be recognized, but some of the mob caught sight of them, even in their Chinese dress and queues, as they rounded a corner. As the mob began to call after them, Hudson and George Duncan looked at each other, then began to run for their lives. Fortunately, it was getting dark, and Hudson knew a shortcut through some fields. After a while, the men looked behind them. No one was following. They ran on, knowing that the crowd would guess they were headed for the Mandarin's house. If the crowd got to his gate first, they would have no hope of getting in to see him. They rounded a corner, and there was the gate to the Mandarin's house about 30 feet in front of them. But racing from the other direction was the mob, knives drawn and yelling at the top of their voices. It was too late for Hudson and George Duncan to turn back. They had to get to the gate first. Faster and faster they ran, getting closer to the gate and to the mob. As the mob was about to grab them, they pushed the gate open and fell into the Mandarin's courtyard. But they had to act quickly. The Mandarin had to know they were in his courtyard and under his protection. Save life, Hudson yelled at the top of his voice as he regained his balance and rushed towards the house. Save life were the only 2 words a Mandarin had to respond to, and quickly the Mandarin's secretary came running out to see what the commotion was. The mob drew back when they saw him. They had lost the opportunity to get their hands on the foreign devils who were under the Mandarin's protection now. The secretary invited the 2 men inside and asked them to wait. The China Inland Mission House was a mile away, and as they waited, Hudson and George Duncan could hear the thousands of people yelling and chanting outside the house. It was impossible to imagine what might be happening to those inside. They prayed as hard as they could while they waited for the Mandarin. Back at the house, the women and children had been sent upstairs while the men stayed below to keep the barricades in place as long as they could. There was a rhythmic slamming against the front door until finally a hammer smashed through it and the table that was propped against it. The men looked around desperately for something to reinforce the barricade with, but there was nothing. The barricades would be completely down in a few more seconds, and William Rutland ran for the stairs. He had to warn the women, even though there was no way out from the second floor. Henry Reed fell out into the garden. About this time, the Mandarin finally agreed to see Hudson and George Duncan. After greeting each other, Hudson, fluent in the Mandarin dialect, explained that their house was under siege and that many foreign lives were in danger. The Mandarin nodded and frowned. "I wonder why?" he asked. "Because all sorts of false rumors have been spread over Yangchow. This morning a new poster said we ate babies," replied Hudson. "And what do you really do with the babies you capture? Where are they now? Are you going to take any more?" asked the Mandarin politely. Hudson was shocked by his questions. Did the Mandarin believe the lies as well? Hudson tried to stay calm. "We have come here to help the babies, not to hurt them. I'm sure you will not find one baby missing in the whole of Yangchow, but it would be a pity to find that out after we are all dead." "Yes," agreed the Mandarin, "but why would the crowds be rioting if there were no reason to do so?" Hudson bit his lip in frustration. "They have been told some incorrect things. May I suggest that first you quiet the crowd and then continue the questions?" Hudson spoke as earnestly and as forthrightly as he could. "Yes, yes, that is a good solution to the problem. You stay here out of sight and I will see what can be done," said the Mandarin as he left the room. Once again Hudson and George Duncan were left alone to wait. They could still hear the shouting and banging in the background. They prayed and waited and prayed some more. An hour went by. They began to wonder if the Mandarin might not be just drinking tea in the next room waiting for the crowd to kill everyone before coming back to tell them he'd got there too late. Another hour went by. Now the noise of the riot had finally died down. Hudson and George wondered why. More time passed. Finally the Mandarin walked back into the room. "Everything is quiet now," he said. "The city's military governor and soldiers have been to your home. They have made some arrests, mainly of people looting your property. They will be punished. You may return home now. I will send an escort to see you safely there, and I will post guards at your gate tonight." Hudson's heart sank. If people had been looting the house, that meant the barricades had given way. If the mob had managed to get inside, what had happened to Maria and the children and the other missionaries? When they finally reached the house, Hudson could see smoke rising from it. The two men kicked their way through the wreckage. Books were ripped apart and scattered across the floor. One wall had been burned, and sacks of rice had been split open and dumped everywhere. The furniture was smashed, but there were no people or bodies in the house. A new convert who'd been in the house came running in. Come here," he said, gesturing for them to follow. Hudson and George Duncan ran out after him. He led them through the courtyard into a neighbor's home. In an inner courtyard of the house they found everyone safe. Hudson cried with relief when he saw them. They told him their tale of escape. When the barricades had been breached, William Rutland had run upstairs to warn the women, while Henry Reed had fled into the garden. The women and William Rutland were trapped upstairs. Their only escape was to jump 15 feet down into the courtyard below. They threw down pillows and quilts to break their fall. As each person jumped, Henry Reed hid them in the well house at the back of the garden. Before they had all managed to jump to safety, some men had rushed upstairs. They robbed the women of their valuables, and when William Rutland refused to hand over his watch, one of the men picked up a brick to smash his head with. Maria threw her arm between the man and William Rutland, so the man had turned to strike her with the brick. "Would you hurt a defenseless woman?" she asked the man. The man was surprised by the question, dropped the brick, and ran to the door. Come up, he yelled to the mob below. William Rutland and the remaining women used the opportunity to jump to safety. Unfortunately, the mob downstairs had set the pillows and quilts on fire. Henry Reed pulled them away, but now there was nothing to break their fall. Maria landed hard and twisted and cut her leg. Emily Blatchley fell backwards as she hit the ground and shattered her elbow. Battered and bruised, they were all safe, and a neighbor gave them refuge in his inner courtyard. Later that night they all returned to the China Inland Mission house. The rooms had been looted, drawers were emptied out, windows were smashed, and the furniture was demolished. Amazingly, though, Emily Blatchley's room was untouched. More amazingly, it was the room where most of the mission records, imported papers, and money were kept. The next day, the Mandarin sent out a proclamation warning the people of Yangchow not to disturb the missionaries again. It ended with the words, "If anything like this occurs again, the offenders will be severely punished. Disobey not." The proclamation was posted on every street corner. A week after the riot, things were back to normal in the city. The missionaries repaired the house, and their ministry in Yangchow continued on and became fruitful. Well, we only have one more chapter. Come back next time and we'll read chapter 15. Have a good day.